And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for.
You will not believe what Princess Anne just did. In one single night, Queen Camilla lost everything. Documents burned to ashes. Her phone wiped clean in the middle of a dark corridor. 15 priceless gifts dumped back at her door without a single word. And then, the moment nobody saw coming, her own husband locked her in a room and walked away. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared Camilla for what Catherine did next.
Parenthood isn't a prerequisite for understanding the importance of the early years. If we only expect people to take an interest in the early years when they have children, we are not only too late for them, we are underestimating the huge role others can play in shaping our most formative years too.
There are moments inside institutions built on tradition and hierarchy where the real decisions are never announced publicly. They are not written into press releases or confirmed by official spokespersons. Instead, they play out in corridors, at dinner tables, and behind closed doors, expressed through gestures and objects rather than words. What has reportedly been unfolding inside Buckingham Palace over recent weeks appears to be exactly that kind of moment. A shift in power, quiet in its delivery, but absolute in its outcome, and one that has left Queen Camilla increasingly isolated from the inner workings of the royal household. According to reports emerging from sources with knowledge of events inside the palace, the situation came to a head in a confrontation near the royal archives. The details, while extraordinary, follow a pattern that royal observers have noted before, where influence within the monarchy is not always exercised through formal channels, but through the control of physical spaces, objects, and access. To understand what happened, it helps to understand what Camilla was reportedly attempting to do in the first place. Sources indicate that over a period of several months, Camilla had been quietly preparing a set of documents that would alter the seating and positioning arrangements for a significant upcoming royal event. These were not rough notes or casual suggestions. They were detailed charts, carefully worked on, that had been designed to look as official as possible. The original printed names on the guest lists had been physically crossed out and replaced with new ones. Courtiers and attendants who had long been associated with the late Princess Diana were reportedly removed from prominent positions, with members of Camilla's own family inserted in their place. The changes extended beyond the guest list. A positioning chart for a future balcony appearance, one of the most photographed and symbolically loaded moments in any royal event, had also been altered. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had reportedly been moved from a central position to one partially obscured by architectural features of the building. The space at the front, in the most visible and prominent position, had been reallocated to individuals carrying Camilla's own family name. The objective, as reported, was to get this dossier into the royal archives and placed into the official document tray on the archivist's desk. Once sealed there with the appropriate markers of authority, it would effectively become a directive for how the event was to be organized. For anyone who understands how royal households operate, control over the administrative record of an event is not a minor matter. It shapes who appears where, who is photographed alongside whom, and ultimately who the public comes to associate with the institution's future. Camilla was reportedly carrying the dossier herself rather than delegating the task, which itself suggests an awareness that what she was doing was not something she wanted witnessed. She walked toward the archive room through the west corridor of the palace, the dossier held close to her body. Princess Anne was already there. According to the accounts that have been shared, Anne was standing directly in the doorway of the archive room, arms crossed, not moving. She did not ask questions. She did not greet Camilla. She simply stood there, blocking the entrance entirely. When Camilla attempted to move past her, Anne matched the movement, using her shoulder to prevent any forward progress. What followed, by all accounts, was direct and immediate. Anne took hold of the dossier. Camilla reportedly resisted, gripping the cover tightly, but Anne pulled it free. She opened it, located the balcony positioning chart, and pressed her finger against the place where Camilla's family name had been written over Catherine's. Then, still without saying anything, Anne walked to the fireplace in the corridor and threw the entire stack of documents into the fire. The papers, the charts, the dossier cover, all of it was destroyed. It is worth pausing here to consider what that act represented. Within a household that operates largely on precedent and documentation, burning a set of documents is not simply an act of destruction. It is a statement. It says that the documents never existed in any legitimate sense to begin with, that they carried no authority and deserved no preservation. It was, in the language of institutional power, a complete rejection. Anne then turned to the archive door itself. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the brass key that was ordinarily left in the keyhole for the use of senior members of the royal family. She inserted it, turned it twice, locked the door, and took the key with her as she left. Camilla was left standing in the corridor in front of a locked door with nothing in her hands. The key itself is worth noting as a detail. Keys, in the context of institutions like the royal household, carry a significance beyond their physical function. They represent authorized access. Holding one means you belong to a particular circle of trust. Having one taken from you, or finding that a lock has been changed while you were not looking, communicates something that no spoken statement could quite match in clarity. The archive room and everything it contained was now beyond Camilla's reach. Outside the palace at this same time, the picture being presented to the public was entirely different. Camilla had been photographed at a charity hospital, smiling and shaking hands with members of the public. The images ran across multiple media outlets and presented a composed, active, and publicly engaged queen consort. The distance between that image and what was reportedly happening behind closed doors in the palace illustrates something that royal commentators have long observed about the monarchy. The public version and the private reality are often running on entirely separate tracks. This gap between public appearance and internal reality is not unique to this situation. Royal households have historically managed their internal conflicts with a great deal of care about what surfaces publicly and what does not. What makes the current reports notable is the apparent intensity and speed of what is being described as an internal restructuring. The events near the archive were not, according to sources, an isolated dispute. They were the beginning of a coordinated effort to limit Camilla's ability to influence key decisions about the household's future direction. The burning of the documents and the locking of the archive were, in that reading of events, not reactions to a single incident. They were the opening moves in a process that had clearly been planned. Anne did not arrive at the archive corridor by accident. She was waiting. The key she used was one she had already decided to take. These were deliberate actions carried out by someone who had assessed the situation and chosen a moment to act. For those who follow the internal dynamics of the royal family closely, the involvement of Princess Anne in this capacity is significant, but not entirely surprising. Anne has long been regarded as one of the more straightforward and direct members of the family, someone with a strong attachment to institutional tradition, and a limited tolerance for actions she considers contrary to that tradition. Her reported intervention here appears consistent with that reputation. What it means for Camilla's position going forward and how King Charles is navigating his role between his wife and the other senior members of his family remain the central questions. The archive is locked, the documents are gone, and the key is no longer where it used to be. The events near the royal archives did not remain contained to that corridor. What had begun as a confrontation over a set of forged documents quickly expanded into something broader, something that played out in front of a wider audience and with consequences that were harder to ignore or quietly absorb. The next stage unfolded at Windsor Castle during a family dinner, and it would prove to be the moment where the balance of power within the household shifted in a way that left little room for interpretation. Dinners within royal households carry a weight that goes far beyond the act of eating together. The placement of people around a table, who sits closest to whom, who is positioned at the head and who is moved further away, all of it, functions as a visible and readable expression of status. Anyone who has spent time observing how these households operate understands that seating arrangements are never accidental. They communicate hierarchy, favour, and standing in terms that every person present can immediately read. Camilla, with her months of experience inside that world, understood this as well as anyone. According to reports, Camilla arrived at the dining room early. The table had been set with a long mahogany surface and formal place settings, the kind of arrangement that reflects the weight these gatherings are given. Rather than taking her seat and waiting for the others to arrive, Camilla walked around the table and began adjusting the name cards. She picked up Prince William's card, which had been placed in a position of clear prominence immediately to King Charles's left, and moved it further down toward the far end of the table. In its place, she put the name card of a member of her own family. Intention behind this was not subtle. Moving William away from the king's side and replacing that position with one of her own relatives was a direct attempt to rewrite, at least visually and symbolically, the order of influence within the room. After the losses of the afternoon, where her documents had been burned and the archive locked against her, this was an attempt to recover some ground. To create an image, even temporarily, of a household in which her family sat closest to the center of power. It did not hold. The head butler, performing a role that in royal households often involves navigating exactly these kinds of tensions without commentary, quietly collected the displaced name cards and returned William's to its original position immediately to the king's left. The correction was made without drama or announcement. It was simply done, and the table was restored to its proper order. Camilla, by all accounts, stepped back and took her own seat to the king's right, her arms crossed over her chest. Charles, seated at the head, avoided her gaze and kept his attention directed downward. When William entered the dining room, the atmosphere had already been shaped by what had just been silently corrected. He was dressed without a tie, a detail noted by those present, which in the context of a formal royal dinner carries its own kind of statement about ease and authority. He did not need the formality. When Camilla saw him come in, she immediately reached across and pulled out the chair directly beside her, creating a visible and deliberate opening. She placed her hand on the back of the chair, holding it out in a gesture that was clearly calculated. If William had accepted that invitation and sat beside her, it would have read as an acceptance of her proximity and, by extension, her continued relevance to the proceedings. William did not slow down. He did not acknowledge the empty chair or the hand resting on its back. He walked directly past it and continued to the far end of the table, stopping behind the chair where Princess Anne was seated. Anne did not look up when he arrived. She simply reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the brass key. The same key that had locked the archive door that afternoon, the one she had removed from the keyhole and taken with her as she walked away from Camilla in the corridor, was now placed on the surface of the dining table. Anne set it down and then, using 3 fingers pressed against its shaft, slid it steadily along the edge of the table in a long, deliberate movement, pushing it directly toward William. The key came to rest at the tip of his shoe. William bent down and picked it up. His fingers closed around the metal completely, and without a word, he placed it into his breast pocket. The room was still. King Charles was watching. Camilla was watching. The staff who lined the walls of the dining room were watching. Nobody spoke. The transfer happened in full view of everyone present, and yet without a single declaration being made. That was, by any measure, the point. What Anne had done in the corridor earlier that day was an act of protection and interruption. What happened at the dinner table was something of a different order. This was a transfer of authority, a deliberate and public passing of control from one person to another, carried out in a setting where its meaning could not be missed by anyone in the room. Anne was not simply handing William a key to a door. She was establishing, in the most visible terms available to her without making a formal announcement, that William was now the person with ultimate say over the royal archives, over the preparation process for royal events, and over the administrative structures that Camilla had been attempting to manipulate. For Camilla, the significance of this moment went beyond the physical object. Throughout the afternoon and evening, she had been systematically stripped of the tools she had been using. The documents were gone. The archive was locked. Her attempt to rearrange the dinner table had been quietly reversed. And now, in front of the king and the household staff, the key that represented access to the nerve center of royal event planning had been passed to William in a gesture that required no explanation. The hand that had been resting on the back of the empty chair slowly pulled back. Camilla lowered herself into her seat, her hands pressed together beneath the table. The gesture she had made, that open invitation that she had held out with such visible calculation, had been walked past without acknowledgement. In terms of the internal language of the household, that non-response was as complete a rejection as it was possible to deliver. King Charles sat at the head of the table throughout all of this. He saw the key placed on the surface. He saw it slide toward his son. He saw William pick it up and pocket it. By all accounts, his response was to close his eyes and press his fingers. against his forehead. He was in a position that would be difficult for anyone, but it was particularly acute given his role. The two people who had just carried out this exchange were his sister and his son. The person who had been on the receiving end of it was his wife, and the action itself had taken place in front of the entire household staff, meaning it was already, in the way these things work, part of the record. There is something important to understand about the position Charles occupies in this situation. A king's authority within his own family does not always translate into the kind of direct control that the title might suggest. Family dynamics operate alongside institutional ones, and when the two pull in different directions, the individual at the centre can find themselves with less room to manoeuvre than an outsider might expect. The consensus that had formed between Anne and William was one that Charles could see and understand, but at that moment appeared unable to counter. The dinner table had become, in the space of a single evening, the site of something that would have lasting consequences. A key had changed hands. A chair had been left empty. A seating arrangement had been quietly corrected back to its proper order. None of it required a raised voice or a formal declaration. All of it was understood perfectly by every person in the room. That is, in many ways, how power has always moved within institutions like this one. Not through announcements, but through objects, positions, and the precise, deliberate language of gesture. By the time the dinner at Windsor Castle had ended, the message delivered through the passing of the brass key had been received by everyone in the room. But for Princess Anne, the transfer of the key to William, while significant, was not considered sufficient on its own. There was a broader problem that needed to be addressed, and it sat squarely with King Charles. As long as Charles remained unwilling or unable to confront what his wife had been doing, there would always be the possibility of further interference. The protection he had, perhaps unconsciously, extended to Camilla by not acting on what he knew or suspected had allowed the situation to develop as far as it had. Anne had decided that this needed to change, and she had the means to change it. In the middle of that same night, Anne went to King Charles's private study. She did not send a message ahead or ask a member of staff to arrange a meeting. She went herself, pushed open the large wooden doors, and walked in. The room, by all accounts, reflected the state of the man inside it. Papers were stacked across the desk. Leather correspondence boxes had been left open. Printed tabloids were scattered among the documents. Charles was slumped over the desk with his elbows resting on the papers, the posture of someone who had been sitting with a difficult situation for a long time and had not found a way through it. Anne placed her briefcase on the edge of the desk and removed a burgundy leather-bound diary. This was not a personal journal. It was a record of the traditional rules governing titles and royal events, a document that had been maintained and passed down since the time of Queen Elizabeth, and one that carried considerable weight within the household as a reference point for how things were supposed to be done. Anne threw it onto the desk, directly on top of the newspapers, and it fell open to the page listing the members authorised to participate in the decision-making process for royal events. Charles looked up and focused on the open page. What he saw there was not the clean printed text he would have expected. Anne had located Camilla's backup drafts, the working copies she had been using to plan her alterations, and had clipped them inside the diary. Across those pages, Anne had drawn thick red diagonal lines through every name that Camilla had inserted into the event's steering committee, names of her own relatives who had no established role within the royal household's administrative structure. The red ink had pressed through the paper with enough force to leave visible marks on the pages beneath. It was not a tidy annotation, it was a deliberate act of crossing out, the kind used historically to mark something as invalid and unauthorized. Alongside the altered lists, Anne had attached an invoice. This was a receipt for an order that had been placed personally by Camilla with private artisan workshops, requesting the production of a batch of gold royal badges intended for distribution among her family members. The use of royal insignia is not something that can be casually commissioned. The badges represented a form of material authority, a physical marker of belonging to and being endorsed by the institution. Ordering them privately, outside of any official process, and directing them toward her own family was, in straightforward terms, an appropriation of royal symbols for personal use. Anne had circled Camilla's signature on the invoice in the same red ink. She leaned across the desk and pressed her finger repeatedly onto that circled signature, making sure Charles understood exactly what he was looking at. He picked up both the diary and the invoice. His hands were visibly unsteady as he held the pages. The evidence in front of him was concrete and specific. It was not rumor or interpretation. It was documentation of decisions Camilla had made and actions she had taken, laid out in a form that required no further explanation. The list alterations and the badge order, taken together, painted a clear picture of someone who had been systematically working to extend her family's presence and influence within the royal household using whatever channels were available to her. Charles set the papers down and buried his face in his hands. Anne straightened up, turned, and left the room without further comment. She had said what needed to be said without saying much at all. The evidence had done the work. What Charles chose to do with it was now his responsibility. Camilla, meanwhile, had not stopped moving. Losing access to the archive and watching the key pass to William at the dinner table had removed two significant tools from her reach, but she still had others. One of them was her personal mobile phone, a private device separate from the palace's internal communication systems. In the early hours following the dinner, she left the main rooms of the palace and made her way down the east corridor, turning into a narrow service passageway that ran alongside the main route and sat outside the coverage of the primary security cameras. She pulled the phone from her coat pocket, unlocked the screen, and opened an encrypted messaging application. She had already prepared a message. It was addressed to an editor at a tabloid publication and to the heads of 3 private jewelry workshops based outside London. The message to the workshops instructed them to accelerate the production of 50 badges bearing her family's crest. The message to the editor contained instructions to prepare and publish a piece framing Camilla's family as having been unfairly marginalised within royal circles. Attached to the messages was a screenshot taken from one of the altered guest lists. Her thumb was positioned over the send button when William appeared at the end of the passageway. He did not call out to her. He simply walked forward, 3 deliberate strides that brought him into the centre of the narrow corridor, his frame blocking the light from the wall fitting behind him. Camilla stopped. Her immediate reaction was to move the phone behind her back, pressing it against the wall and out of sight. William kept walking, closing the distance between them until she had taken 2 steps back and her shoulders were against the stone wall. He reached around behind her, located her wrist, and gripped it. As the pressure increased, her fingers opened and the phone dropped. He caught it before it reached the floor. The screen was still active, still displaying the drafted messages, the attached image, and the list of recipients. William read through it and then began working through the phone methodically. He deleted the drafted text. He permanently removed the attached image from the device's storage. He went into the contacts, found the numbers associated with the media group and the workshops, and deleted and blocked each one individually. The process took roughly 2 minutes. When he had finished, the phone showed nothing but an empty home screen. He dropped it face down, let it fall to the carpet, and slid it toward her with his foot. His instruction to her was direct. She was to withdraw all personal directives she had issued and was not to bring any item or document into the event venue that did not carry the official royal seal. Then he turned and walked back out of the corridor. Camilla picked up the phone. Every contact, every draft, every piece of communication connected to her plan had been removed. The device was functionally useless as an instrument of the strategy she had been pursuing. With both the archive and her communications now closed off, she turned to the one remaining resource she had direct control over. From a safe built into the wall of her private bedroom suite, she retrieved 15 velvet gift boxes containing some of the most valuable personal assets she had accumulated. Among them, a diamond-encrusted platinum pocket watch, sapphire-set gold cufflinks, and a triple-strand pearl necklace. She packed all 15 into a leather bag and just before 11 at night, carried it herself to the residential wing on the 3rd floor, where senior courtiers and veteran aristocrats with voting rights on the household's personnel committees were accommodated. She went door to door along the entire corridor. At each one, she placed a velvet box on the carpet, knocked 3 times, and stepped back to wait. Not a single door opened. There were no footsteps from inside, no voices, no acknowledgement of any kind. Silence met her at every stop. After working her way through all 15 doors over the course of 45 minutes, she made her way back to her room with an empty bag and sat down to wait. Just after 1 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. 5 senior butlers, dressed formally in black tailcoats and white gloves, were moving in single file toward her door, each carrying a silver tray. Arranged on those trays were all 15 velvet boxes, every one of them returned. The lead butler tipped his tray at her threshold, and the boxes slid onto the carpet. The others followed in sequence. When all 15 had been deposited at her door, the 5 butlers turned and walked away together without a word. The boxes lay at her feet, their contents untouched. Every senior figure she had approached had declined, and they had done so in a coordinated manner that made the collective nature of the rejection impossible to miss. There would be no allies recruited through gifts that night, and the manner of the refusal left no room for a second attempt. Camilla was, by that point, operating entirely without support from within the structures of the household she had been trying to influence. The morning that followed brought with it a moment that moved the entire situation from the private interior of the palace into the public eye, though not in any way that would have been immediately legible to the people watching. On the surface, it looked like a routine public engagement. A senior member of the royal family stepping out of a vehicle, entering a public building, meeting people, being photographed. The kind of appearance that fills the royal calendar regularly and rarely attracts much beyond polite coverage. But for those who understood the context of what had been unfolding inside the palace over the preceding hours, what Catherine wore that morning carried a significance that went well beyond fashion or personal choice. Princess Catherine arrived at a national museum for a scheduled public engagement, stepping out of a black armoured Land Rover and walking into the main entrance hall. The press presence was substantial, with camera operators and photographers from major news agencies already in position. Catherine wore a navy blue wool coat, a clean and composed choice that drew the eye without distraction. But it was a single item pinned to her left lapel that became the focal point of the coverage, and the focal point of something considerably larger than a public appearance. The brooch she wore was a piece from the Royal Archives, a hexagonal green diamond at its centre surrounded by 12 teardrop-cut white diamonds arranged around it. It was not simply a valuable piece of jewellery, it was one of the core treasures held within the archive room, the very room that Princess Anne had locked with the brass key the previous day, and the room from which Camilla had been permanently excluded as a consequence of everything that had unfolded. The fact that Catherine was wearing it, in public, in front of dozens of cameras, was not an accident of styling. It was a statement delivered in the most visible setting available and addressed to an audience that extended far beyond the museum courtyard. To understand why the brooch mattered in this context, it is necessary to understand what access to the Royal Archives represents within the household. The archive is not simply a storage room for historical objects. It is the space where the physical markers of royal continuity are kept, where the items that connect one generation of the family to the next are held and protected. Being granted access to those objects, being trusted to wear them publicly, is a declaration of position within that line of continuity. It says, without requiring any words, that the institution has recognized this person as belonging to its future as well as its present. Catherine appearing in public wearing a piece drawn from those archives on the morning after the archive had been locked and the key handed to William was a confirmation delivered in the most tangible terms possible. In the museum courtyard, the reception was warm. Members of the public had gathered outside, and the crowd responded to Catherine's arrival with the kind of enthusiasm that has characterized her public appearances for years. People waved, called out, pressed forward. Catherine moved through the space with the ease of someone who has spent a long time learning how to be present in exactly this kind of setting. At one point, she raised her right hand and briefly touched the surface of the green diamond at the center of the brooch, holding the gesture for long enough that the photographers around her could capture it clearly. That pause, those 5 seconds with her fingers resting on the stone, ensured that every camera in the courtyard recorded the same image. The brooch was not incidental to the appearance, that was the point of it. Inside Buckingham Palace at that same moment, King Charles was in his private study watching the coverage broadcast live on television. He would have seen the brooch the moment Catherine stepped into frame. He would have understood immediately what it signified, given everything he had witnessed the night before at the dinner table and everything Anne had placed in front of him during her late visit to his study. The images of Catherine in the courtyard, smiling with the crowd cheering around her, the brooch catching the light on her lapel, represented the public face of a transition that had already been decided in private. Charles watched it play out on the screen in front of him and then reached forward and turned the television off. He turned around. Sitting in the armchair in the corner of the study were the 15 velvet boxes that had been returned to Camilla's door in the early hours of the morning. They had been brought through to the study at some point, and Camilla herself was in the room, seated in the armchair with her face buried in her hands. The scene inside the study was the mirror image of the one broadcasting from the museum courtyard. Outside, clarity and affirmation. Inside, the wreckage of a strategy that had failed at every point it had been attempted. Charles walked to his desk and picked up the receiver of the internal telephone. He called through to the central security room and spoke to the captain of the guard. His instructions were specific. Camilla's keycard access was to be revoked for 3 areas of the palace: the treasure archives, the event records room, and the corridor housing the offices of the aristocratic council. These were precisely the spaces through which she had been attempting to exercise influence: the archive where the forged dossier had been headed, the records room where event documentation was stored, and the council corridor where the senior figures she had tried to reach with her gifts had their offices. Charles was, in effect, drawing a formal boundary around all of the spaces that had been the sites of conflict over the preceding 24 hours and placing them permanently outside her reach. After hanging up the telephone, Charles walked over to the velvet boxes. He found an empty cardboard box nearby and began placing the jewelry cases inside it, one by one, tossing them in without any particular care for the value of what was contained within them. When all 15 were inside the cardboard box, he carried it over to where Camilla was sitting and placed it on her lap. He did not say anything. There was no conversation, no exchange of any kind. He simply set the box down, straightened up, and walked toward the door. He crossed the threshold, took hold of the brass door handle, and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him with enough force that the sound of it closing was audible down the corridor. He then reached into his trouser pocket and produced a long steel key. He inserted it into the lock set beneath the door handle and turned it clockwise twice. The bolt, 2 inches of solid steel, slid out from the doorframe with a sound that was dry and final. Charles pulled the key from the lock, returned it to his pocket, and walked away down the corridor. The act of a husband locking his wife into a room is not one that lends itself to straightforward interpretation, and it would be reductive to treat it as simply a domestic gesture. Within the context of everything that had happened over the previous day and night, it was something more specific than that. It was the moment at which Charles stopped absorbing the consequences of Camilla's actions and started responding to them directly. The protection he had previously offered, whether consciously or through inaction, had been withdrawn. The locking of that door was the physical expression of a decision that had already been made in other ways throughout the preceding hours, and it brought the internal process of what observers have been describing as a purge to its conclusion. The sequence of events, taken as a whole, forms a pattern that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a coordinated and deliberate restructuring of the household's power arrangements. The burning of the documents near the archive established that Camilla's attempts to alter the official record would not be permitted. The locking of the archive and the removal of the key established that her physical access to the spaces where those records were kept had been terminated. The passing of the key to William at the dinner table was established publicly in front of witnesses, who now held authority over those spaces. The late-night visit to Charles's study with the evidence of the invoices and the altered lists removed the possibility of him continuing to avoid direct engagement with what had been happening. The interception of the phone in the service corridor removed her ability to route around the people who had closed off her other avenues. The collective refusal of the courtiers and aristocrats to accept her gifts removed any remaining possibility of building a coalition of support from within the household. And the locking of the study door removed, finally, any ambiguity about where Charles himself stood. What the brooch on Catherine's lapel represented in the context of all of this was the affirmative side of the same coin. Every action directed at Camilla over the course of those hours had been, at its core, a removal of something. Access, documents, contacts, influence, support. The brooch was the opposite of a removal. It was a conference. It was the institution saying through Catherine that the person authorized to carry its most significant physical symbols forward into the next generation had been identified, and it was not the person sitting in the locked room with a box of returned jewelry on her lap. The crowd in the museum courtyard continued to cheer. The photographers continued to capture the image of Catherine with her hand resting lightly on the green diamond. The coverage spread across broadcasts and publications throughout the day, most of it focused on the warmth of the public reception and the detail of what she was wearing. Very few of the people watching would have had the context to understand the full weight of what they were seeing. But within the walls of the palace, and among those who had been present for the events of the preceding 24 hours, there was no ambiguity at all. The structure had shifted. The lines of authority had been redrawn. The spaces that mattered had been locked, and the keys were now in different hands. What remained to be seen was how those newly drawn lines would hold over time, how the household would manage the ongoing presence of someone who had been so thoroughly excluded from its inner workings, and what the longer-term consequences of this particular realignment would be for the family as a whole. Those questions extended well beyond Camilla herself. They touched on the futures of every branch of the family, navigating their place within an institution that had just made its priorities very clear, and did so in a manner that, true to the way these things have always worked, required almost no words at all.